Legend of Grimrock is in every facet a 3D, first-person, grid-based, dungeon-crawling video goddamn game. It has modern amenities and unique aspects that I definitely enjoy and that make it stand out, but the entire game is absolutely about delving into one massive dungeon. There's no towns or NPCs, just your party and floor after floor after floor of monsters, traps, and puzzles. I respect the idea, it just feels very honest, and in execution it winds up doing a lot of things right. I'm Kalice, and I recommend The Legend of Grimrock. Oh, and before we get too far along here, for anyone wondering, I've been going through a rough spot of mental health lately, and that's why I haven't really been present on YouTube. I honestly have no idea if that's going to last, so I don't want to make specific promises about when you'll see another thing, but yes, hi, hello, I'm still alive, it's good to see you too. Also, I'll delve into this in detail later on in the video, but I'm gonna go ahead and give a generalized jump scare warning for this game and video along with it. There's not really crafted jump scares, but just the way that the game is tends to lend itself to dangerous things suddenly being very, very close to you, so fair warning. Four prisoners are given the choice to face the challenges of Mount Grimrock as an alternative sentence. Should they overcome the challenges of this massive, mysterious mountain and discover its secrets, their crimes will be forgiven. The prisoners that choose this fate are stripped of all their belongings, chained together, and thrown into a hole atop the peak of the mountain. Our protagonists are four such prisoners, whose only hope of escape is now through the entirety of the convoluted and incredibly dangerous dungeon that is Mount Grimrock. Story-wise, they're all blank slates. We know they were prisoners, but that's pretty much it. No idea if they were actually guilty, what they were imprisoned for, how they might know each other. Nothing. Theoretically, this means that you can ascribe whatever traits you want to your party of four if you'd like to. For me, this of course meant that they were four anti-establishment transgender lesbians who, over the course of the adventure, found both a family and passionate romantic love. Listen, I know what I'm about. If I can make it queer, I'm gonna make it queer. But none of that will actually be reflected in-game, of course. Humans are there because of course they are. From the very brief lore blurb, seems like the standard fantasy fare for them: industrious, up and coming, quick learning, fast expanding, etc. Nothing particularly interesting there. The other choices for races are fun ones, not what I'd expect from a selection of races this small, which is pleasantly surprising. Those being minotaurs, insectoids, and lizardmen. Seriously, I absolutely love that aside from human, all of the races are weird picks. One of my biggest eye-roll broad criticisms for fantasy versus sci-fi as a whole is that the races in fantasy tend to always be the safest possible choices. I'm delighted to see that that's not the case here. And for the record, I do love Lord of the Rings. I'm just very tired of the standard thing of human, dwarf, elf, and knowing everything to expect along with them, you know? There's a very standard class setup: warrior, wizard, and rogue. They do what you would expect, more or less, and there's other choices you make during character creation, but I don't want to delve into the subtle nuances of buildcraft until I've explained how the gameplay actually works, so you at least have an idea of how it'll be reflected in game before I overload your brain with information. I'm far more okay with the standard spread of classes existing as opposed to races because it's actually tied into mechanical expectations. New weird classes are super cool in things, but there's not always a need to reinvent the wheel if you can be inventive in other aspects of gameplay, especially in that seeing those familiar concepts executed on and realized differently can be enjoyable in its own right. So the game is grid-based and first-person, as I mentioned. There's a setup where you can play with just a mouse or touchscreen, but with a mouse and keyboard, the default setup is that you use WASD to move to different squares and use Q and E to turn your party to face another direction. All of your movement is locked to that grid. Same thing goes for enemies. To be clear, enemies, combat, and some puzzles function in real time. The only way you can take infinite time to calmly appraise your situation and put together a plan is if you pause the game. These things give the game a cute flavor, and it has a very tangible effect on the gameplay. You very often have to think about room layouts and positioning in regards to the combat. Getting attacked from multiple sides is a very good way to get very dead very fast, especially in the early game, while dodging around enemies as they try to attack you can lower the incoming damage. It rewards both smart and skillful play while ensuring that encounters always present a number of options in how to approach them. In the bottom right corner of the screen, there's all the stuff related to your characters. Portraits, health, energy, and to start at least, your character's hands, both left and right for all of them. Health is pretty straightforward. People get hit enough and they die. If you are even passingly familiar with the medium of video games, this should not be particularly surprising to you, but I'm delighted to be the one to explain the concept to you if you somehow hadn't picked up on the information already. If everyone dies, it's a game over and you'll have to revert to a previous save. The only way to bring back a dead party member is to reach and interact with a save crystal. You can already save whenever and wherever you want, but these save crystals also fill your health and energy, so they're definitely super useful. After using a save crystal, they become inert for a while, so you can't just lame out combat encounters in that particular way. You right-click on the box representing someone's hands to have them attack with whatever is in their hands. Then, based on their stats and the stats of whatever weapon they were using, they can't attack again for a set period of time. If there's nothing in the hand you click, characters just kind of impotently swipe at whatever's in front of them. Melee weapons swing at whatever's on the tile in front of you. If it's a throwing weapon like a rock, throwing star, or bomb, it flies a few tiles forward or until it hits something, those somethings being almost strictly limited to things that actively want to murder you and, like, walls. Bombs are consumed when thrown because of course they are, but other things can be retrieved by walking over them or picking them up again based on the circumstances. Proper ranged weapons are slightly more complicated in that you have to put something into both of the character's hands, the actual weapon and whatever the ammunition is. Right-clicking the weapon fires the ammo forward, generally further and stronger than something could be thrown, but the related resources are generally more scarce. That said, the ammo is still reusable, so I prefer these to throwing weapons. There are fairly standard and straightforward options. Slings yeet rocks, bows fire arrows, crossbows fire bolts. You can also find enchanted arrows and bolts that deal additional magical damage on hit. You can still retrieve the ammunition after firing, but if it actually hit an enemy, then the enchantment will have been consumed. It'll just be a normal arrow or bolt after that. Resource management, baby! Since weapons only occupy a single hand, and only ranged weapons automatically need you to use both, there are a variety of offhands you can use, generally shields to bump up your defensive capabilities, or torches to provide a light source. In the course of leveling, each character can learn special attacks tied to weapons or even unarmed combat. Usually these are one big hit or a sequence of rapid attacks. They have a chance of activating every time that character attacks with the related weapon and will use energy when they do so. They definitely happen often enough to be a valuable addition to your moveset once you acquire them, but the only part of this combat system that I don't really like is that you don't get to control when these things happen. I'm sure balance would need to change somewhat if you could just trigger them whenever, but it would make them more fun to use. You know, actually being able to use them. Magic is easily the most complicated aspect of combat. Instead of punching, wizards have magical hands. When you right-click one of these magic hands, a new panel with 9 runes comes up. You select a combination of runes and then hit the casting rune, and a spell will come out. Or not. Leveling schools of magic will unlock the ability to cast new spells, but you still need the knowledge of what runes you need to select to actually make that magic happen. Any attempt to cast will cost energy. If you run out of energy, no magic. It regenerates over time. The game and included manual teaches you everything you need to know. Each individual spell has a spell scroll that tells you the related runes, as well as the skill requirement. There is a lore explanation of each rune in that manual that you can use to help you puzzle out which runes would correlate to basic spells. And there's a logic to each spell's runes in relation to the others. Ranged spells all have a similar format to them. If you know how to cast a light spell, you might be able to figure out a darkness spell. I don't want to spoil too much about the system. I'll probably only show maybe 4 spells total in this video, but I encourage you not to look anything up about the system online and just try to figure it out for yourself with the resources the game gives you. This feels like one of those rare instances where game mechanics both create a unique gameplay experience and provide an insight into the lore of the setting. It's kind of perfect. The runes made me feel like I was actually a wizard advancing in magical skill and knowledge, sometimes learning from new sources, sometimes making new discoveries. Logicking out a new spell before the game gave me the scroll felt really good. More complex spells tend to be more useful, and getting better at selecting those runes quickly during combat provided a skill-based aspect to the casting that made it clear that it's not just all about knowledge. I found the entire system delightful, and if you really desperately don't want to deal with figuring out the runes, you can, of course, just look them up online. The positioning of your party in relation to each other and the map has a very tangible effect on gameplay. This is going to sound like an entirely obvious statement, but you can only really attack things that you're looking at. Things that you aren't looking at can totally hit you, though. Where each party member is in that little square in the corner is actually very important. You can switch them around at your leisure, even mid-combat if you want to get fancy. With some exceptions, people with melee weapons are only going to be able to reach enemies to hit them if they're on the front line. And as long as you're facing them, most enemies are only going to be hitting those same front liners. If you get attacked from the side or behind, then your party members in those positions are the ones who will take the damage. The same logic applies to enemy groups that you might encounter. If they're moving together as a unit, most attacks aren't going to hit those on the back line until the front line is dead. You don't get to choose who in your front line is being targeted for attacks, and you don't choose which of the frontline enemies to target if there are multiple. It's all dice rolls. It's an obvious gameplay contrivance, but that's fine by me as long as I'm having fun, which I very much was. Bombs and magic are an exception to the frontline-backline rule. They hit everything in a group all at the same time. These mechanics make groups of enemies feel unique, while also giving magic a unique flavor in combat, both from the player and enemy side of things. So you've got 2 defensive stats to mitigate incoming damage. These probably matter far more for your frontline characters than your backline if you're playing properly. Protection is very simple, and matters more if you're going for a heavy armor build. Any damage that character would take is reduced by how much protection they have. Gear affects this the most, but some things you select at level up can also have an effect. Evasion matters more for the roguish types. Evasion determines if a character will get hit at all. If they successfully dodge, they take no damage. In addition to the scaling off of dexterity, you can also gain more evasion from gear and leveling. There is more meaningful overlap to these builds than none at all. Normally, equipping heavy armor lowers that character's evasion stat, but warriors can level up in such a way that they remove that penalty, meaning they'll still dodge sometimes even in that heavy armor that massively mitigates the hits they do take. By the same marker, light armor usually also gives some protection, so if attacks happen to slip through, the character won't just immediately die. Shields add to evasion, which might sound strange at first, but within the logic of the game's systems, it makes sense that an attack that got blocked by a shield wouldn't deal any damage at all to the person wielding it. It's always interesting to see how game mechanics try to convey or line up with real-world logic, or if they just outright ignore it. At least I think it's an interesting subject, but sometimes I think weird and specific things are interesting. Oh well. All in all, by late game, evasion is probably the more valuable stat, as it can potentially completely negate incoming damage sources, but you'll be hard-pressed to properly outfit 2 frontliners with equipment that entirely complements evasion, so protection definitely still has its place, even at endgame. Grimrock's gameplay was inspired by a lot of games that I honestly haven't played and before researching this topic hadn't even heard of. Apparently a game called Dungeon Master is the primary inspiration. With that research, I found this type of combat system definitely was not invented by Grimrock, but it seems like Grimrock greatly modernized it. I can barely control my obsessive impulses, so of course I'm side-eyeing a few of those older games. It was a bit odd to get used to at first. I at least haven't encountered anything that feels quite like this, but once I dealt with wrapping my head around the core principles, I found it to be a system with a very low skill floor and a very high skill ceiling. A lot of hits can be outright avoided if you move around the enemies correctly, and there are often ways to use traps or the environment to your advantage. Overall, the game is very difficult, but not unfairly so. You will probably take a few deaths on your first go through, but as long as you save often and try not to waste resources, you'll probably make steady progress. More than anything, I just found the combat to be fun. From appearance alone, it's not particularly flashy, but I found it to be uniquely engaging. Back to all of those fun little gameplay details and my slightly more specific opinions. If you want to heal or restore energy and aren't anywhere near a save crystal, or the one you're near is currently inactive because you recently used it, you can also rest, which causes the entire screen to go black and time to pass quickly, which means that your health and energy will regenerate much faster in your time. However, if an enemy happens upon you while you're resting, you'll only forcibly wake up when one of your party members is dead. I'm sure this is genuinely terrifying, though I never experienced it myself. It's sort of risk-reward, though enemies don't just spawn randomly, so as long as you've cleared out whatever section you're in, or lock yourself into a little room, you're probably fine. As you progress through Mount Grimrock, you also start getting strange dreams when you rest. You have to rest for a few seconds before they trigger. In these dreams, a mysterious entity somehow related to Grimrock entreats you for aid. I won't reveal any details about this, but I will say that I thought it was really cool. It seems like the game stores dreams you haven't seen, at least up to a point. If you embrace sweet narcolepsy and rest a few times as you reach each floor, you'll almost certainly see all of them. Sometimes to progress, or simply to get some extra goodies, you'll need to solve a puzzle of some kind. This game does a very good job of introducing concepts slowly and rewarding you for thinking in clever ways without ever directly tutorializing you on certain mechanics. If you understand how different systems interact, some puzzles even have multiple ways to solve them or secret rewards to find. It's really neat. There's magical teleportation, a variety of traps, pressure plates, the fact that you have projectiles, and a few other elements that can all interact with each other. It never really feels like the game is asking you to solve the same kind of puzzle over and over. There's always some sort of new trick, twist, or combination of elements, and it provides a nice sense of variety as you make your way through the very, very, very long and delightfully convoluted dungeon. Those extra goodies you can find actually have a fairly obvious in-game name. Secrets. There are a lot of resources or magical items tucked away in the long-forgotten but shockingly well-maintained corners of Grimrock. Most of these are discovered by solving an optional puzzle, thoroughly exploring in every way you can, discovering an extra aspect to a puzzle, or most often finding a secret button somewhere on a wall. As a whole, these greatly reward attentive exploration and puzzle solving. There are enough of these sprinkled throughout the game that it feels rewarding to actually pay attention to every nook and cranny for buttons or other oddities. Usually you're just straight up rewarded with useful resources or gear, many of which is unique or individual. Sometimes you'll also receive a golden key, which you can use to unlock a variety of treasure rooms. Important note about these, you do not get enough golden keys to open all of these rooms, so maybe save before you use a key to make sure the room has something that you actually want to use before going onward and downward. As a weird and often seemingly arbitrary to everyone outside of my own mind pseudo-completionist, I found these secrets a super enjoyable aspect of the game. If you want to be sure to get everything on a single run, you could reach the end of a floor, then consult a guide to find everything you might have missed, which would still allow you to enjoy all those aspects of discovery and exploration without being paranoid that you might have completely missed a piece of content. I'm definitely not at all projecting here. Some of the more interesting rewards you might find through either exploration, those secrets, or spending your oh-so-precious golden keys also include entire gear sets that help with certain build specializations, weapons that can deal elemental damage, accessories to augment your stats alongside your armor, some of which might come with a powerful effect alongside a detrimental one. I always find items like those interesting, even if I don't wind up using the functionally cursed things. I at least find the element of thinking about whether or not the trade-off is worth it stimulating. Again, I'm weird with these things sometimes, I recognize that. I still love myself, or at least try to. Depression sucks. At any rate, there's also those spell scrolls that I mentioned before, perhaps some ways to permanently enhance your character's various statistics and abilities, potions with a variety of effects that I won't spoil. There's a wide variety of stuff here, and while you likely won't be able to make use of every single thing you find, there's enough variety that it's always going to be something interesting. And when you do get that super special item that fits one of your characters just right, that feeling never gets old. Yeah, cringe me. The loot's cool and it's fun to find. I couldn't ask for more in that respect. Oh, and you can also find alchemy ingredients and recipes and flasks, because alchemy's a thing. After you find a mortar and pestle, if you have an empty flask on hand, you can combine the weird plants you found in this extremely deadly dungeon into a variety of strange magical liquids that your party is apparently willing to drain, even in the heat of battle. Let it never be said that adventurers are not brave. Much like the magic system, a lot of the fun of alchemy comes in finding recipes to expand your variety of options, or experimenting and discovering those new potions or bombs for yourself. It's an overall solid addition to the game. Making effective use of the system can give you that extra edge in combat you might need, and for those really tough fights, you can totally craft more potions mid-combat. You only have so many flasks, but you can carry a lot more of those ingredients. Also, the image of one of your party members whipping out alchemical tools and panickingly mashing and stirring up a bunch of plants in the midst of combat is a wholly delightful image. Not that you'll have time to enjoy that particular corner of your mind palace in the moment, because you will be the one juggling all of the aspects of combat while also putting all of the ingredients into place and making sure that potion goes down the right throat. Good luck! As you're exploring the numerous poorly lit corners of Grimrock, there's very little chance of becoming permanently lost. You have a map, you see, and automatic mapping is the default setting, but this can be disabled if you want to pull out the graph paper and map things out for yourself. I absolutely do not. That process would probably drive me insane, and I almost certainly would make compounding mistakes that led to a complete unraveling of my mental state. But it's cool that it's an option for those that enjoy that kind of thing. I'm now suddenly second-guessing that thought of checking out those older dungeon crawling games. Shit. You can also mark down notes on any square of the map if there's something you want to come back to later. In addition to just directly walking to where you want to go, there will also sometimes be holes that you can fall into that lead to unique areas. Your screen briefly goes dark as you fall down, you take a bit of damage because gravity, and then you'll probably be in a small contained part of the floor below. Maybe with secrets, maybe with enemies, maybe with both, or maybe with nothing, because that's just how adventuring be. There are also magical teleporters which can take you to unexpected places. Rather often, you will encounter areas that you can't access without keys, possibly multiple keys, which means you need to explore the floor to complete challenges or solve puzzles to progress or find some hopefully pretty cool stuff. This very much helps the game feel less strictly linear, often giving you the choice of multiple directions to go in or challenges to overcome. As I so cleverly and subtly foreshadowed 2-ish paragraphs ago, light is an aspect of the game. If you aren't using a torch or some other light source, then you can't see as far, which means you'll have less time to react to enemies. It's also much harder to spot a variety of secrets or solve puzzles if you can't see as much. Most light sources are a technically finite resource. Torches, for example, eventually start to flicker and then burn out, which means that if you want a steady light supply, you need to bring multiple with you. At worst, I found it to be somewhat inconvenient. I never really ran out of torches, even as I somewhat leisurely explored every nook and cranny of this gigantic, seemingly endless mountain dungeon. But in general, I actually quite enjoyed it because inventory management is actually a rather massive part of this game. As a long-term fan of Resident Evil, I very much enjoyed this. Each member of your party has a set number of inventory slots and a carrying capacity determined by their strength stat and a few other aspects. You access each character's inventory by clicking their portrait. Every item has a different weight value, because of course it does. Heavy armor should probably be harder to lug around with you than one individual rock. Some items can stack, arrows for example, some cannot, like torches and flasks and potions. It's not quite Resident Evil 4 in this respect, but I still found it satisfying and fun. If characters get near their carrying capacity, they'll be slowed. If they go over their carrying capacity, they will not be able to move. And because your party is chained together, you can only move as fast as your slowest party member. Who is carrying what can also matter, primarily because someone can't use a potion that isn't in their inventory. Equipped gear will also count against each character's carrying capacity, so you can totally deck your backline wizard out in heavy armor to increase their survivability, but they probably won't be able to carry much else, because why would you be giving a wizard more strength? In general, you'll probably want torches, potions for mid-combat problems, whatever treasures you want to actually take out of the dungeon, and anything you might want to have on hand for puzzle solving, like a few rocks to weigh down pressure plates and things to that effect. And, you know, the things that your characters have equipped. Oh, and also, you'll probably want a good supply of food. Time for a bit of a touchy subject. There is a hunger system in this game. Generally speaking, I'm not fond of these. Works mostly as you might expect. Slowly, a hunger gauge ticks down and your party members need to eat some sort of food to fill it back up. Food does not stack in your inventory. Once the gauge gets low enough, party members stop recovering health and energy from resting. Hunger cannot out and out kill your characters, but once the gauge is empty, their attack power will be halved. It is a good idea, shockingly enough, to not let your character starve. There are a few reasons that I'm actually more than okay with this system. The biggest thing is that if characters could die from not eating food, I'd feel pressure and probably a not super deserved level of anxiety from the system. I would constantly feel like I needed to babysit the hunger meters. I don't like just staring at meters, but whenever I wasn't looking at them, I would be worried about them. This is how it is for most games with a hunger system for me. As it stands, I can let the system function in the background and only address it from time to time, usually while fiddling with my inventory or preparing for a big fight, as opposed to constantly managing and checking it, because the punishment for letting it run out is just a temporary and easily corrected penalty. It also helps that the rate that the hunger bar degrades is rather slow and only goes down when you're moving around and doing things, or resting. I generally like to go at my own, sometimes slow pace in games, especially while exploring on my first time through something. A hunger system usually incentivizes speed, but I simply never felt rushed here. Plus, there is more than enough food. You generally find it very often, and if you pick up everything you find, I can't see how you would ever run out unless you were going out of your way to waste time or resources. Finally, it's a part of the whole inventory and weight management thing, with different foods weighing differing amounts and restoring more or less of that ever-ticking down hunger bar. And so this adds another layer of decision-making to those systems, to what resources to bring with you as you continue your adventure. I found the inventory and resource management aspect fun, and appreciated the hunger system's place in and interactions with it. I don't like hunger systems in general because they stress me out. This never felt even slightly stressful after I learned the system, so I didn't have a problem with it. If I had to point to like a core repeating theme of this channel, it would be that execution can be the single most important aspect to why something does or doesn't work, or at least why I do or don't like something. I dreaded the idea of a hunger system when I realized this game had one, and I was actually kind of enjoying it by the end of the game, all because of those fiddly little details. The other recurring theme, of course, being trans fucking rights. As you delve deeper, you can find bags and chests to expand the number of inventory slots. This lets very strong characters actually carry way more stuff and allows you to more conveniently organize everything that your squad is lugging around with them. If you want to be a hoarder like me, bags and chests also make for a convenient way of organizing literally everything you found in the game that you don't have the strength to carry in some room somewhere. This is what being a completionist looks like to me. Don't forget to mark your treasure/junk hoard on the map. It is a very big dungeon after all. Now that you have all of that gameplay context, let's delve into some of the nitty-gritty character building stuff. One potentially massive grain of salt on the many words I am about to speak. These are my impressions and thoughts based on a single playthrough, not the end-all be-all objective truth about the game's balance. Making choices in terms of character creation and leveling up is always one of my favorite aspects of any game with a system like this, but this definitely strikes me as a game where you can wind up building a character who isn't particularly useful, which is never a particularly delightful feeling. I'll go into many more details very soon, but the general rule of thumb is that I'd advise you to make each character as hyper specialized as they can be without making themselves a hindrance in some way. Jack of all trades characters are going to be useful early game, but the stuff the game throws at you in the final few floors can be absolutely brutal if you're not prepared for it. The faster you can deal with potential threats, the more situations you're likely to progress through without needing to repeatedly reload a previous save and tackle a situation over and over. You also don't want too much overlap between members of your party, so you can get a better use out of most of the loot you find. Generally speaking, there's only one best sword, and another very obvious statement coming up here: 2 sword users can't both use it at the same time. Character creation might be a bit daunting to anyone who isn't familiar with fantasy RPG conventions. An explanation is given for each stat in-game, so you can hopefully figure things out if my explanations here don't do enough. In addition to races and classes, there are 3 major elements of crafting your quartet as you progress through the game: attributes, traits, and skills. Attributes are your core statistics, those being strength, dexterity, vitality, and willpower. For the most part, these function as expected. Strength lets you carry more and scales damage with almost all weapon types. This includes bows and thrown weapons, which I'll ask you to keep in mind for the very immediate future. Dexterity lets you hit more often, dodge more often, and scales the damage of daggers. Strangely enough, accuracy only matters for melee weapons. I wouldn't worry about the stat for most warrior builds because of stuff I'll explain later, and even ranged rogues benefit more from strength. Dexterity is most valuable for melee rogues. Vitality gives more health at the start and upon level up. Willpower is the same, but for energy. Each of the attributes also affects elemental resistances in various ways. Honestly, don't worry about these too much. I'm sure some are better than others based on what exists in the game, but these resistances aren't so strong that they should be the reason you pick a stat. It's just like a nice bonus to have. Each race gets different attribute bonuses and detriments. You can make whatever set of classes and races you want, but I wouldn't advise creating a situation that's an uphill battle for your first playthrough. As fun as the concept totally is, at least consider avoiding a Minotaur wizard. Maybe. After character creation, you only gain attributes in a sort of roundabout, slightly indirect way, so even from character creation, you should know what niche each character is going to occupy and give them attributes that you know they will use. Traits are probably the most fun and interesting aspect of character creation. They're a fairly wide selection of passive abilities or themed stat increases to select from. You can give 2 to each character, and there are a few that are exclusive to each race. You only get to select these at character creation. Again, based on what I've told you about how the game works, you probably want a very clear idea of what each member of your party is going to be doing, so you can select traits that they will definitely benefit from. If you're going to have a rogue on the front line, you probably want to give them evasive, for example. I'm not going to go through every single one of these, but I will flag up some potential pitfalls and interesting ones. There are some traits here that are just better than other ones that I want to highlight because it's potentially unclear without a slightly specific knowledge of the game's systems. Willpower and vitality add to energy and health every time you level. The sooner you get those stats, the more benefits you'll see. Meaning that in the long term, healthy and strong mind, which give you higher attribute scores, are better choices than tough and aura, which just add a flat amount to health and energy. Conversely, attack power is super valuable, meaning that for raw damage, not counting through magic, aggressive, which adds +4 attack power, is much more impactful than athletic, as the 2 points of strength it provides only translates to 1 attack power. Easily the most interesting trait, in my collectathon-loving opinion, is Headhunter. This is a Minotaur racial exclusive trait that increases attack power for every skull in that character's inventory. Skulls are a collectible scattered all throughout Grimrock that only have a use if you have this trait. I absolutely adore both the mechanics and theming of this trait. If you're planning to go for a completionist run of the game, or at least planning to be fairly thorough in your exploration, it's absolutely worth bringing a Minotaur with this trait to benefit from all the skulls you find. But if you happen to have a party with 2 Minotaurs, it's only worth giving this trait to one of them. There's only so many skulls in the game, so it follows the same logic as for the gear you can find. Up last is skills, which is the aspect you'll be interacting with the most over the course of the game. It is also, unfortunately, by far the least intuitive of these systems. The surface of the system is fairly simple. Each class has a variety of skills available to them. At both character creation and as you level up, you choose which skills to improve by spending points on them. As you improve each skill, there's usually a passive benefit that improves with every point, and at various milestones you'll gain attributes, abilities like strong passives or special attacks, or the ability to cast new spells. At character creation, each character gets a few of these points, and when each character levels up, they gain 4 skill points, in addition to health and energy based on their vitality and willpower respectively, of course. Each of these skills has a cap of 50. Unless you hyper-specialize, you probably won't reach 50 with most of the skills you put points into without actively grinding, which you do not at all need to do to complete the game. This is absolutely for balancing reasons, but it does feel somewhat lackluster to finish a game without getting to experience the really cool abilities you gain by mastering the skills that you've been leveling up for hours and hours through your whole playthrough. Even with a completionist run where I killed every single enemy I came across and found every single secret, I only got 1 of my character's skills to 50. I do ultimately like this system, but I think it would feel more rewarding if the skill caps were easier to reach and maybe gave slightly less powerful abilities. Skills are where the real danger of building a character that just isn't very effective comes in. Distributing your points too thinly will absolutely make the endgame enemies a nightmare to deal with, but specializing too specifically might make characters lack a reliable offensive or defensive presence in combat. Having someone who doesn't seem able to ever hit or is dealing very little damage, or a frontliner who dies from very few hits once you're 15 hours into a 20-hour game, doesn't feel great, to say the least. With that caveat, it is a rewarding system once you know how to navigate it, but the only way to really know how to navigate it is to pay very close attention to the information the game gives you, and even then you might wind up restarting if you don't like some aspect of your party. For this reason, I'm pretty much always in support of there being a respec option of some kind, just in case you make a mistake at some point and don't want to completely restart your playthrough or go back to a much earlier save to correct it. This game does not have one of those, so be careful. On that note, I'm going to give a fairly brief overview of what each of the skills do and how worth I think they are to spend points on from the perspective of someone who's finished the game once and quite enjoys Buildcraft. I'm sure those with more knowledge of the game could go more in depth or maybe have different takeaways, so grain of salt and all that, but this should be enough information that you can decide what sounds fun to you, so you hopefully won't have to restart an incomplete run. Also, I just like talking about these things, and life's too short to not do the things you want to do, so let's do it. The first of the warrior skills is athletics. It gives a broad range of statistical gains, except for willpower, and convenience abilities like needing to eat less food or being able to carry more. Putting points into this doesn't give any passive benefit, and the abilities aren't particularly useful. Your points are better spent elsewhere. Armors is the primary defensive skill for warriors. Each point spent makes armor more protective, you gain defensive stats, health, protection, and evasion at various thresholds, and the abilities you gain have to do with removing penalties for armors. Because your warrior is almost certainly going to be on the front line, it's definitely worth spending the 16 points to get heavy armor proficiency, and might be worth investing the 25 to get shield expert. It just depends on if you want to spec more for survivability or damage. They're both valid. The axe, mace, and sword skills all occupy similar roles. They're all melee range weapon skills for warriors, and spending points in each skill increases that character's attack power, accuracy, and chance of performing a special attack with that weapon. There's no point in investing in more than one of these, but any points that you don't spend on armor, you should absolutely spend on the weapon of your choice. Warriors are just simple like that. They hit hard and they take hard hits. Woo-woo. Any of them are a fine choice, but if I have to rank them, I'd say that swords are potentially the strongest because the ability they get at 50, which just passively doubles the attack speed of swords, is ridiculously strong. But pushing for that will probably require investing less in your warrior's defensive traits, which could be risky. Axes are the best if you're not going to get the skill to 50, likely the safest bet for your first run. Mace's potential to pass through armor once you get deep into the tree is strong, but the tree doesn't build strength. My one build-based regret was giving my warrior maces because I very much would have appreciated just a bit more carrying capacity by the end of the game, and the potential for armor piercing is either devastating or completely useless depending on the enemy. Ultimately, you can just go for whatever you feel like between these, you'll definitely be fine. Unarmed combat is an interesting one. You can train your fighter or rogue to fight without a weapon. Like with the warrior's weapon skills, each point you put in raises the attack power, accuracy, and chance of activating unarmed abilities. If you get it all the way to 50, it's rather strong. Before that, it seems weaker than the weapon-based skills. There's an ability in there that enhances evasion, which makes me think that it synergizes a bit better with other rogue skills than the other warrior skills, but ultimately either would work. I love that this is a thing. If I ever play through a normal run of the game again, I'd absolutely use at least one unarmed character, but for a first run, I'd recommend specializing in weapons so you can take advantage of all that sweet, sweet loot you find. That said, there is more loot than none at all that an unarmed specialist can take advantage of. There's just nowhere near as much of it. Rogues are up next. Assassination is a skill with interesting abilities. It's another skill that doesn't give any passive benefits, but the abilities from the tree are potentially very strong, depending on context. The increases to attack speed are just good all the time, but gaining the ability to backstab with melee for extra damage is either very strong or very weak, and it just depends on each room's individual setup of enemies, as well as your skill at navigating around those enemies. I shied away from this skill because without knowing what the game was going to throw at me, I didn't know how strong it would be. And investing in the skill would mean lowering either general offensive or defensive capabilities on my frontline rogue. Also, I didn't want a situation where one rogue was getting kills in a way that the rest of the party couldn't get XP from, because unfortunately, only those who actually hit the enemy in a fight get experience, which is lame. It'd be a fun skill to play around with on a repeat playthrough, and I do like the flavor of it encouraging sneaking up on enemies, but I'd advise avoiding it on your first go. Daggers function in the same way as the melee weapons for fighters, but they scale off of dexterity instead of strength. Investing in the skill passively raises attack power, hit chance, and chance of causing special moves. Like I said, it's the same. This is your only option for a melee rogue, and it's very reliable as the dex gains from the skill also add on to the evasive capabilities of the character. Missile weapons and throwing weapons are the ranged options for rogues. Ranged weapons always hit as long as the enemy doesn't physically move out of the way of the projectile before it reaches them. The general rule of thumb for choosing which of these to invest in is that throwing weapons are easier to find, but missile weapons are stronger. So of course I invested in missile weapons. Again, the beginning of the game is much more forgiving than the end. You would probably be fine with a throwing weapons rogue, and I fully admit to thinking that the idea of a party member being solely dedicated to yeeting death at the enemies is enticing. But if you're planning to thoroughly explore, missile weapons just seem to outclass them by the end. In fact, for a ranged rogue, they only ever need to invest in the skill for the weapon type they're specializing in, which is why missile weapons is the only skill on any character I had that reached the maximum of 50 by the end of the game. And weirdly, even once that skill reached 50, none of the other skills seemed particularly valuable for her, so I just diversified to chase attribute point bonuses, which was a strange change of pace from absolutely knowing where I wanted my other character skill points to go and desperately wanting more for them. Dodge is the defensive skill for rogues. There is no passive benefit to the skill. In addition to health at certain thresholds, you gain massive increases to evasion, both in the form of raw statistical gains and in the form of abilities that double the evasive benefits of various types of equipment. This is invaluable for a frontline rogue. It's likely worth investing at least 17 or 24 points depending on how defensive you want them to be. As I mentioned before, unarmed combat also exists for rogues, but we already covered that, so we're moving on to the mysteriously mystical. Mage skills are a bit different because of course they are. Mages are just like that, I guess. For combat magic, there's 4 primary skills: air, which is lightning magic, earth, fire, and ice. As tempting as it may be to go all slightly chillier than normal avatar and master all 4 elements, again, jack of all trades characters tend to be pretty weak by endgame. Spells always hit, so you don't have to worry about accuracy, and they always deal the same amount of damage unless you get a specific ability in each tree that enhances one spell's damage output or find certain pieces of equipment. The primary concern of mages is energy management. Every time you cast, it costs energy. Fittingly enough, investing in each skill makes it so that casting spells of that type passively costs less energy. Investing in each skill also gives that mage the ability to cast new spells, 4 in each that are focused in some way on combat, with the exception of air, which gives a 5th spell with utility uses. However, you have to invest a bit further into the skill to learn all of the spells for air. This is probably a balance thing, which, hey, fair enough. Also, there are a small handful of enemies with elemental immunities. They're fairly rare, but they do exist. So you probably want to focus one elemental skill type up to a point, because there are very few ways to raise a caster's overall damage output. Getting the ability that improves the damage of one of your spells for the element of your choice is worthwhile. After that, it becomes diminishing returns to focus that single skill. Honestly, the abilities that you get at 50 for the elemental skills aren't that great. In order to deal with an enemy with an immunity to your specialization, you probably want to grab the first spell from one of the other skills just so your mage can be putting out at least some damage in those engagements. Air and fire are the easiest to use. Ice's basic damage spell has range but does less damage. Earth's basic damage spell is sort of a DOT with potential area denial. I'd advise avoiding Earth as your primary spell skill on your first playthrough. That basic damage spell leaves a poison cloud on a tile for a set period of time. This poison cloud can also hurt your party, which can wind up fucking you over, especially if you want to get all fancy with the footwork. I went with air because the portrait I picked for my insectoid caster reminded me of a common rider, and that just felt right. This is also why I named her Shin. If you fully understand why I chose that name specifically, I appreciate you. I bring this up because while I do think you should try not to fuck yourself over with an overtly terrible build, I also think you should try to do what you think is fun. It's a video game, it's supposed to be fun, so do fun things, whatever that means to you. Anyways, on with the over-explanation and analysis, which is fun for me, and hopefully fun to listen to for you if you're here listening to this. Hi. There's another spellcasting related skill called Spellcraft. Investing in this skill can teach you 2 new spells, massively increase your energy reserves, as well as increases the speed at which you can cast spells, by lowering the cooldown between casts. The 2 combat caster abilities that increase how fast you can cast are invaluable. Nothing else will increase a mage's overall damage output as universally as that, assuming they have energy reserves, and even if they run out, there are ways to refill it, many of which don't rely on a resource as long as you're clever or stubborn. There are very few combat engagements that you can't in some way gain a reprieve from, so you can rest and restore your caster's energy. Even if you don't invest heavily in this skill, I'd advise putting at least 5 points into it sooner rather than later for the utility spells it gives. They're really useful. Finally, there's Staff Defense, which is the defensive skill for mages that augments both protection and evasion. If you only have one mage, then they should 100% be on the back line, which makes the skill not particularly worth investing in. Ironically enough, the statistical requirements for equipping staffs actually come from the spellcraft skill as opposed to the one that literally has staff in the name. Again, as much affection as I've developed for the system, some aspects maybe aren't the most intuitive thing in the world. As I mentioned before, unfortunately, characters only gain experience in combat if they hit the enemy before it dies. I hate that this is the case, as it made me very often go out of my way to sit there waiting for one specific character to stop missing when I could have already finished the fight. It also paradoxically can make critical hits feel bad if they wind up depriving other party members of experience. It's one of my few major criticisms with the game, and it's thankfully changed in the sequel, so yeah. All of those disparate pieces of the game are all well and good on their own, but the overall design of this massive dungeon really helps bring together and solidify the experience into something memorable. There's no random generation. Every puzzle, item, enemy, and secret is placed by intended design. The game never feels repetitive because it's constantly throwing something new at you, or at least a new twist on a familiar concept. The level design is what ensures the existing mechanics are well used. Resource management and leveling up is more engaging because you never know what group of enemies might be around the very next corner. Scraping all of the walls for secrets is rewarding and engaging because they're placed in such a way that you'll be finding interesting and useful things fairly regularly, but actually acquiring all of those things will very often require you to be clever and pay attention. Something I'm admittedly not always the best at doing, but when I inevitably faltered in some way on that, I knew that the guide and Lily's extra pair of eyes were there to help me out. It's incredibly clear that thoughtful design is behind every floor of this dungeon, and it's just really fun to engage with moment to moment because of that. I've sort of avoided talking about this so far in the video, but I've specifically left out one enemy type from this video for a long-winded but ultimately very simple reason: fear. I have absolutely no idea how intentional this is, but the Legend of Grimrock is kind of horrifying. The way you move through the world lends itself to you encountering unexpected enemies who are suddenly incredibly close to you. The enemy models are all 3D, and I'm not sure if it's the Uncanny Valley or what, but there's just something unsettling about the way they look and move, at least to me, especially with the sound design. Ugh. The game is usually very minimalist in its sound, which means that if you suddenly hear a noise right next to you, it's probably because something is trying to murder you. Combine this with the fact that many enemies have attack animations that fly towards the screen practically into where your party's models would be if they existed. There's nothing to obscure or distract from these animations aside from your party's own, usually very brief attack animations. Add in the fact that sometimes you're dropping down holes, teleporting, resting, or enemies can teleport in or spawn in behind you from a now revealed monster closet, and you have a formula to wind up absolutely terrified. If you play this game on mobile, please try not to fling your phone or tablet across the room in a state of panic as some sort of creature sneaks up on and then lunges at you. As much as I like Grimrock, no game's worth breaking your phone over. Probably. So again, just a generalized jump scare warning for the game. I'm personally usually okay with jump scare-ish content. I think it can actually be kind of fun to get that sudden, unexpected jolt of fear, but only in a context where I'm at least kind of expecting it and am definitely in real life safe. Like when playing a horror game or watching a scary movie, I'm of course expecting it. And it's not real and I can walk away from it at any time, so I'm of course safe. Grimrock very quickly teaches you that this can happen, so I didn't wind up having a problem with that particular aspect of it, with one very notable exception that heavily and unfortunately regularly impacted my experience. Not to bury the lead for too long, but before you get worried if you share my particular fears, I'm purposefully going to avoid showing these, primarily because I genuinely don't think I can handle reviewing footage that contains these particular creatures in this particular game. Grimrock is a fantasy setting, and much to my constant suffering, everywhere from Middle-earth to Thedas to the Forgotten Realms, one of the many threats that plagues the populace is giant fucking spiders. Grimrock is no exception, and I am absolutely terrified of them. They are one of the many enemy types in this game that has an attack that basically puts them on the camera. There are instances of them spawning in behind you or otherwise sneaking up on you. I've found different ways to cope with different media with these creatures because it's so fucking common, but this game doesn't really give me any wiggle room. It's just the whole screen, the whole time they're there, and honestly, it's something I probably wouldn't be able to handle on my own. Thankfully, like many games these days, Lily was here to help me out. What we wound up doing for most of the game is listening ahead for this particular enemy type. There are auditory cues for pretty much every enemy type in the game, and when we thought there was one nearby, Lily would take over movement and camera controls, and I would cover my face so I couldn't see any part of the screen, except for the character boxes in the corner, which meant I could click on stuff to attack. A somewhat inconvenient solution, but it let me at least continue playing the game without constantly freaking out. I'm sure Lily could tell you that I was still very much on edge for any section shortly before or after the encounters, and was at least minorly freaking out while we did this, but it allowed me to actually experience the game, which, as I'm sure you can tell by the existence of the rest of this video, is something I truly deeply enjoyed. There's one particular section I should probably highlight that scared me so much that I think it potentially worsened my phobia, and it absolutely caused me to have a panic attack. There is a section where multiple of these fucking things teleport into a room around you as you enter, and there's also another very threatening enemy nearby. And at the time, I was preparing to end the session soon. There's no meaningful lead up to this, so I wasn't prepared at all, and I was very much not okay. It's quite possibly the worst non-real spider scare I've ever fucking had. Ah! Fuck! Is that what we're doing? Is that what you want in there? I invite you on here for a chance to brag about how good of a person you are, and instead you fucking scare me while I'm recording?
Yes.
Yeah?
Yeah.
That's what you want?
Yeah.
Okay. Lily was thankfully there to both help me calm down, and she took over controls, cleared out the spiders, and then let me play when I was ready to deal with the other enemy, which just so happened to be the first instance of a new enemy, because of course it fucking was. Even just talking about it right now is kind of freaking me out. I was originally not even going to make videos on these games because I absolutely wanted to avoid exposing myself to them again, but it should be a testament to how much I enjoyed the series that I'm here talking about it now, despite the absolute terror it caused me at the time. That's the same joke twice.
Yes.
That's clipped audio, I bet. I'm gonna have to fucking tweak things and work with that.
You're welcome. Glad I could be there for you.
Love you too.
I did it.
All right. That's what you want.
Oh, so you know recording Lily's evil.
It was an open floor. You could do what you want. My heart is pounding. I want a fucking burger. Obviously, there was the option of just not playing the game, but I really did enjoy pretty much everything else it had going on, so I wanted to play it. That said, it was definitely a very negative aspect for me. Obviously, this is an incredibly incredibly subjective criticism, if you aren't afraid of spiders, your experience will obviously differ. But 1, it's an incredibly common phobia, so I'm rather sure it will affect other people as well. 2, I can only ever experience games as myself. I really wish I could have just enjoyed everything that was here. Instead, there's this one thing that greatly impacted my enjoyment. It's a bummer, and it will probably stop me from revisiting the game. I definitely can't play it on my own, at the very least. Now, I should point out a potential solution that does exist. There's a dungeon editor for this game, and someone went through and recreated the entire game, replacing the spider enemies with other enemies and removing spider eggs entirely, which are just an environmental element, but do sometimes have to do with finding items in the environment. The existence of this is awesome. Unfortunately, engaging with this would have required starting the game over from scratch once I recognized just how big of a problem it was for me in this game. You also wouldn't be able to get a good chunk of the achievements, which would have been fine by me, but I'm sure isn't to some people. And there's at least one sort of special Easter egg with narrative significance that you can't engage with that's tied into unlocking a special way to play through the game again. It is a better alternative than just not playing the game at all if you're interested but have a similar problem to me. It's just a shame that the solution that exists isn't quite perfect. My ideal solution would be a mod that just replaces the model of the spider with something like a snake, or does what Grounded does with modularly taking away the various visual features of the model of the spider, or something to that effect. But as it stands, no such solution exists that I know of. Before we wrap up here, I just want to quickly touch on a few other things. The game very much gave me like a Dungeons and Dragons tabletop kind of vibe. More so in the gameplay than in the story. I felt like I was slogging through a very long D&D dungeon in a good way, and I'm sure the grid-based nature of the game was a large part of that. There's also more than a touch of an interesting take on my favorite D&D creature buried in here, which I am very happy about, but will not at all elaborate on. There's also that rather interesting Easter egg I mentioned. If you do a certain deed in the normal game, then follow certain steps during character creation, you can play through a special version of the game. I won't spoil the details, but it's basically a run with one character who is much faster and has a unique set of skills that doesn't match any individual class. Definitely an interesting way to get more out of the game that I would 100% engage with, if not for my big fear of that one fucking enemy type. I didn't really talk about the story much because there's not a lot here. Aside from the dreams, you can find some notes from a previous explorer of Grimrock that add some world building and a bit of a more personal touch to what you're going through. The primary draw will likely need to be the gameplay loop if you want to stay engaged, but what is here is well written, and I found it to be mysterious and enticing enough to want to find out more. Unfortunately, the small amount of story present also means that I don't necessarily feel comfortable explaining much of it. I don't want to give too much away, so I'll just say that I enjoyed it, and that it does wind up explaining the various mysteries of Grimrock. I've got no complaints about it. Oh, I should also mention that there's some additional world building details in the game's manual, so you should give that a look-see if you're interested. Honestly, going into this game, I didn't really know what to expect. It seemed kind of generic, but I had only ever heard positive things about it. And now that I've actually played it, if not for my one very big sticking point, I'd probably already be planning ways to replay it over and over, or figuring out which custom dungeons were worth my time. As it stands, it's a very unique and fun experience that I'm very glad I had someone to help me with my phobia through. If that particular fear isn't a concern to you, and you're looking for a super fun and inventive take on traditional Western fantasy RPGs that is engaging from beginning to end, you cannot go wrong with The Legend of Grimrock. It is so fucking good. This has been Kalice. If a mod to deal with the problem exists, please please fucking tell me about it, Brunel. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed my take on being thrown into a horrifying, seemingly endless mountain dungeon, liking the video really does help more people see it because of annoying YouTube math. Skipping on down to the comments to tell me what you thought of the game also helps. Or just like, let me know what you had for breakfast. I probably had fast food or a yogurt or nothing because cooking right after waking up isn't super fun. My Patreon exists if you'd like to support me. There's neat bonuses like access to my Discord server where sometimes I post about dumb monsters that I love from old tokusatsu shows, so feel free to go look at that. Speaking of, big thanks to all of my current patrons like Lada, Edith, Sam, and Guilty Sonder, all of whom are really cool people. Keep loving what you love, and I'll see you next time with something else. You know what the most annoying part of this phobia is to me, other than like the obvious thing of real world inconveniences when one pops up? I like to research things that confuse me to try to understand them and thus understand parts of myself and potentially deal with them. But this particular phobia is so widespread and universally used as the example of phobias that seemingly every fucking article that touches on the topic uses pictures that can cause me panic attacks. I'm sure there's information or techniques out there that could help me cope or at least give me a bit more understanding and peace of mind on the subject, but I can't functionally or easily access that information. It's a bummer. This is a bummer note to end on. I'm sorry. I'm gonna go hug a stuffed animal. You do the same. We'll both do like a wholesome thing.